Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, and this video is going to be quite an interesting and an exciting one. I was actually able to get my hands on an MSI RX 480 Gaming X 8GB version, so I thought I'd do a head-to-head comparison of this card against my good old MSI R9 390. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this comparison and make this video for you guys is to see how these two cards stack up against each other. You guys probably already know this, but for those who don't, these two cards are basically within a similar class in regards to performance. Apparently these two cards trade blows with each other, but will there be a definite winner in this head-to-head battle? Another reason why I wanted to make this video is because I get asked from people whether they should buy a brand new RX 480 or buy a used R9 390. If you're lucky, you could probably find a used 390 for much cheaper than a brand new RX 480. However, that's assuming you're comfortable with buying used and know the risks of used technology and computer hardware. Let's finally kick off this comparison with some introductions of our two contenders, starting off with the MSI R9 390. The MSI R9 390 has a base clock of 1000 MHz, and this specific model has a boost clock of 1060 MHz. In regards to shaders, this card has 2560 stream processors or 64 ROPs. This card comes with 8GB of GDDR5 memory, which is clocked at 1525 MHz and has a 512-bit memory interface. Now in terms of the I/O, the 390 has two dual-link DVI-D connectors, one HDMI 1.4a connector, and one DisplayPort 1.2 connector. This card's power consumption is rated at 275 watts, and it requires one 8-pin and one 6-pin VGA power connector from the power supply. The R9 390 that I have was able to overclock to 1150 MHz to the core clock and 1650 MHz to the VRAM. Moving on to our second star of the show, the RX 480. The MSI RX 480 Gaming X Edition out of the box has a core clock of 1360 MHz. This card has 2304 stream processors and 32 ROPs, so half the amount that the 390 has. This card also comes equipped with 8GB of GDDR5 memory, which is clocked at 2025 MHz, and has a 256-bit memory interface, so faster memory clock speeds and half the memory interface. For the display I/O, this card has one dual-link DVI-D connector, two HDMI 2.0b connectors, and two DisplayPort 1.4 connectors. The MSI RX 480 has a much lower power consumption rating of just 150 watts and only requires one 8-pin VGA power connector from the power supply. The RX 480 that I have was able to overclock to 1390 MHz and its memory was overclocked to 2150 MHz. In terms of aesthetics, these two cards actually look and have very similar features, which is obvious since they are both from the same sub-vendor. The main differences are that the RX 480 is using the newer Twin Frozr 6 cooler, which is using the new Torx 2.0 fans, which have a steeper curved blade design, which will allow for better airflow and efficiency. The red stripes on the RX 480 are also LEDs, whereas the old R9 390, which is using the Twin Frozr 5 cooler, only has non-illuminated red stripes. The other main difference is that the heatsink on the R9 390 is considerably thicker when compared to the one on the RX 480, which makes sense considering its higher TDP. As you guys can see here that due to the R9 390's heatsink, it actually is a 2.5 slot card, so some might actually see that as a disadvantage or a con. But apart from that, there really isn't that big of a difference from the old Twin Frozr 5 that the R9 390 uses when you're comparing it to the RX 480. They both have that traditional MSI black and red theme we've all come to love or hate, and they both come with a black backplate. So now that we've gone through the specs for both of our graphics cards, let's take a look at the system I'll be using to do this head-to-head comparison. For the CPU, I'll be using an Intel Core i5 6600K. And yes, before one of you guys starts writing in the comments, I know that I should be using an i7 to eliminate or reduce any sort of bottlenecking factors. However, I don't have one, so this is what we'll be going with. Although I have overclocked my 6600K to 4.6 GHz, which should help reduce the bottlenecking factor in this test, and a 6600 should not really be bottlenecking these cards of this caliber anyways. Now for the CPU cooler, I have a Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo with two Corsair SP120 fans attached to it for a push-pull configuration. For the RAM, I have 16GB of G.Skill Ripjaw's V-Series DDR4 memory clocked at 2800 MHz. The motherboard is a Gigabyte G1 Gaming GA-Z170X-Gaming 7. In regards to storage solutions, I have a Samsung 950 Pro M.2 NVMe SSD for the boot drive and two Western Digital 1TB hard drives, one of which is a Caviar Black and the other is a Caviar Blue. Powering the whole system is an EVGA 750W G2 power supply, and the case is a Corsair Speco 2. Now my test methodology is pretty simple and straightforward. I ran the benchmarks of these two cards at their stock clocks, or in this case their factory overclocks, at both 1080p and 1440p. Then I applied my own overclock settings and ran the same tests again. Majority of the titles I used for this comparison are from 2016 with a few exceptions, so this will make the test in this video as relevant to modern gaming as possible. I also included a couple of synthetic benchmarks. You can find all the relevant and important information, such as information about the graphics cards, components, and the games list in the video description down below. So now that I've gone over the specifications for the two graphics cards, the components of our test system, and the test methodology, it's time for the moment you guys have all been waiting for: benchmarks. Starting off with Grand Theft Auto 5, this is a fairly demanding open world title from last year. Across all four tests, we can see that the R9 390 is holding the lead, but the RX 480 is not too far behind. At stock clocks, you can see that the R9 390 and the RX 480 are both fairly close in terms of performance, but when running the cards overclocked, the R9 390 just slightly widens the gap here. Moving on to our second title, Rise of the Tomb Raider, running on the DirectX 12 API with asynchronous compute enabled. In this game, we can see an opposite story from what we saw in Grand Theft Auto 5. In this case, the RX 480 is the one holding the lead across all four tests, with the R9 390 trailing not too far behind. At stock clocks, the RX 480 seems to be ahead by an FPS delta of about 3 FPS, but when using the overclock settings, the R9 390 seems to catch up and basically ties the RX 480 at 1440p. Up next, we have Hitman 2016 running on the DirectX 12 API. Here we see that 3 out of the 4 tests, the R9 390 is just ahead of the RX 480. Although at 1080p with the overclocked settings, there's about a difference of 5 FPS between the two, and at 1440p using stock clocks, they are tied. So again, we're not seeing any huge differences between the two cards, and handle this game with very similar performance. But let's move on. Onwards to Doom using the Vulkan API. Now if you take a good look at the results, you'll notice that across all 4 tests, we see that the average difference in frame rate between the 390 and 480 is about 5 FPS. In other games, we were seeing a difference about 2 or 3 FPS, so Doom shows us that the Vulkan API favors the 390 a bit more. However, all these test numbers from both cards are completely acceptable. At 1080p, both cards will get you frame rates in the 140s, and even at 1440p with near max settings, you can play this game with an average frame rate within the 90s. So overall, great performance from both of these cards. Again, no matter what you choose between these two cards, you'll still attain amazing performance. The fifth title in this benchmark is Total War WarHammer, an RTS which was released this year and later had DirectX 12 support implemented on this. So in this case, we're going to be obviously testing on the DirectX 12 API. At 1080p, stock or overclocked, it looks like the 480 has the win over the R9 390, but at 1440p, we see a different result. At 1440p, running with the stock settings, we see them basically tied at 58 frames per second, and when overclocked, the R9 390 takes the lead there. But this is the fifth title which actually shows us how close in performance these two cards are. We haven't seen anything too drastic where one card has like a 10 FPS or 15 FPS lead over the other. Not yet, that is. But anyways, let's move on. Next up, we have Battlefield 1, which was one of the most anticipated shooters of this year. Note that for Battlefield 1, I decided to test both of these cards on DirectX 11, and I had a good reason for that. For those of you that are unaware, I actually made a video about this earlier, where I compared the performance of the 390 running Battlefield 1 on DirectX 11 and DirectX 12. I had a side-by-side showcase of both of those two APIs running in Battlefield. I'll have a link to that video, and you can check it out if you want to, but basically the main takeaway was that DirectX 12 would provide a higher overall frame rate, but there was a lot of stuttering introduced, and there were some pretty heavy and steep frame drops. So if I had tested these cards using DirectX 12, sure, you would probably have seen higher numbers here, and on paper, or graphs in this case, that would have looked better, but that doesn't tell the full story here. I made sure about that because even after the patch, both cards were exhibiting stuttering. So the results show us that the 390 seems to be trailing behind the RX 480 in this game by about 3 frames per second. At 1080p with overclocked settings is where we see these two cards tied. So we can add Battlefield 1 to the list of games where these two cards are basically neck and neck. Now let's take a look at a couple of racing games, starting off with Dirt Rally. This game shows us some weird results in regards to the RX 480, which showed negative performance scaling at 1080p with the overclock settings. Not entirely sure as to what was going on there, but what's also interesting to note here is the noticeable difference between the R9 390 and RX 480. At 1080p with overclock settings, there is a difference about 10 frames per second, and at 1440p the gap between the two cards is around 5 FPS, and that increases by a bit when using the overclock settings. Also, notice how the 480 barely shows any increases at 1440p from its stock settings. So clearly in this game the 390 seems to have the advantage. Moving on to Forza Horizon 3, a beautiful open world racing game set in Australia. This title basically showed us the opposite of what Dirt Rally shows us. At 1080p, the RX 480 holds the lead over the R9 390, and at 1440p, widens the gap even more. At 1440p with stock settings, the RX 480 is pushing 13 frames per second on average, higher than the R9 390, and the gap is just slightly decreased when using overclock settings. So in this game, the RX 480 shows us that it has a significant advantage over the R9 390. What's also fascinating to see here is the difference in performance in general between 1080p and 1440p. As I mentioned before in my performance overview of this game, scalability isn't such an issue, and you can crank up the resolution and not have to worry about a performance hit on your frame rate. Let's continue our benchmarking showdown with Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. At 1080p, we see the R9 390 ahead, and the gap is further widened when the two cards are overclocked. However, at 1440p, they perform more closely, where at stock settings, they are pretty much on par with each other. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege was tested next, a strategic first-person shooter from last year. Across all the tests, these two cards performed pretty close, with the highest difference being shown at stock 1080p, with the RX 480 in the lead. And in the middle, we can see the cards performing very closely. And the last test at 1440p showed the R9 390 just barely edging out the RX 480. I decided to include one of the most popular Twitch titles released this year, Overwatch, as I knew many people would be interested in performance numbers from this game. For this game, only the stock settings were used for each card. At 1080p, we see a considerable difference between these two cards, where the RX 480 holds a 10 FPS on average lead over the R9 390. Once we bump up the resolution to 1440p, we see the difference between these two cards is narrowed down significantly, both maintaining over 60 FPS though. Moving forward, we have a very popular title from the Xbox platform making its way onto the PC, and one of my personal favorites, Gears of War 4. I decided to include this game since it's a phenomenal port and is very well optimized for the PC. 3 out of the 4 tests show us that the RX 480 leading with the R9 390 too far behind, and the very last test run at 1440p with overclock settings shows the R9 390 taking the lead there. So great numbers from both of these cards, and whether you're going to be playing at 1080p or 1440p, these cards will offer great performance at both resolutions. Up next, we have Titanfall 2, which is another fantastic shooter from this year, which sadly got overlooked by many because of its close relative release date to Battlefield 1. Regardless, the numbers here are looking great. For this game, there really isn't much to say here. The R9 390 and the RX 480 are showing performance very close between each other. I mean, just take a look at the 1080 scores, where you have the R9 390 averaging 95.6 FPS and the RX 480 averaging 95.3 FPS. And if you take a look at the 1440p results, you have the R9 390 averaging 62.7 FPS, whereas the RX 480 gets about 62.4 FPS. So all the tests show us a difference within 1 FPS. Solid performance at both resolutions. This next title I really just threw in for the hell of it, and that is Quantum Break running on DirectX 11, since this is the Steam version. Performance from either of these two cards is not great, with neither really being close to even 60 FPS at 1080p, and both cards just managing over 30 FPS on average at 1440p. So performance really is not looking great for either of the cards, R9 390 or RX 480. Hopefully some patches are released in the near future to help alleviate performance issues. The last game we have on our list is Civilization 6 running on DirectX 12. At 1080p, these two cards are basically tied. At 1440p, we find that the R9 390 falling just short of the performance the RX 480 attained. We also see that you can play at both 1440p and 1080p and barely see a difference in performance between the two resolutions. Moving on, we have a few synthetic benchmarks, starting off with 3D Mark Firestrike. So at stock settings, the R9 390 scores 13,049 and the RX 480 scores 13,755. When overclocked, the R9 390 scores 14,191 and the RX 480 scores 14,491. So at stock settings, we see that the RX 480 is ahead by about 5%, and when overclocked, the R9 390 shortens the gap by about 2% here. Up next, we have 3D Mark Time Spy, and the R9 390 scores 4,015, and the RX 480 scores 4,212, and when overclocked, the R9 390 scores 4,357, and the RX 480 scores 4,443. So again, we're seeing that when overclocked, the R9 390 is just shortening the gap a bit more there. And by the way, these are all graphics scores. The last synthetic benchmark that I did was UNIGINE Heaven, and at stock settings, the R9 390 scores 1,349, and the RX 480 scores 1,369, and when overclocked, the R9 390 takes the lead at scoring 1,448, and the RX 480 just trailing right behind it at 1,444. So that pretty much covers the benchmarking segment of this video. Before I continue, I just wanted to ask you guys a question. Do you guys like it when I talk through the benchmarks, articulate the results, and talk about some of the noteworthy differences? Or would you rather just see the graphs with some music playing in the background? I wasn't really too sure on what you guys prefer, so let me know in the comments, I'd appreciate it. Now that I've shown you guys the benchmarks, it's clear as day that these two cards do indeed trade blows with each other. Majority of the titles, with the exception of a couple, showed us that whether you're using an RX 480 or an R9 390, you'll get about the same level of performance. No card showed a significant advantage over the other. Now I know I didn't really review or show anything related to VR, and that is an area where the RX 480 would show better performance over the 390, as it has better VR tech implemented. However, if you really don't care about that stuff, then you really wouldn't go wrong buying either card. So that brings up the question, should you go out and spend the money on a brand new RX 480 when you could perhaps find a used R9 390 which will give you about the same performance? However, the used market scenario probably doesn't apply to everyone since it varies so much by where you are in the world. You may not find a 390 for much cheaper, and that's something that I've actually seen firsthand. In my region, I've seen people selling R9 390s for as much as new RX 480s. You may also not be comfortable buying a used graphics card as well. The other thing I wanted to mention, and going through the results, and more specifically looking at the 1440p results, did you guys notice how many of the games showed that these two cards offer great performance at this resolution? There were about 2 titles that only showed performance lower than 60 FPS, but other than that, these two cards perform very respectively at 1440p. So that means you don't necessarily have to go out and spend lots of money on something high-end for a 1440p 60 FPS experience. At near max settings, these two cards perform admirably. Well guys, that pretty much covers this showdown between the RX 480 and the R9 390. Please leave your comments and thoughts down below in the comment section, and leave a like and share this with anyone who you think might be interested in this video. I hope this video helped you guys out, and if you did, then definitely leave a like. Also, if you want to see more content like this, then consider subscribing to my channel. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.